He grew during the war as a military commander, but at the beginning, he showed a considerable degree of incompetency. For instance, at the Battle of Long Island, he left the end of his line open. The British were able to run around it, to nearly catch his whole army and destroy it. Everywhere he went, people thronged to see him, and the church bells would be set to pealing and cannons would be fired off in his honor.
The Pennsylvania Journal said, "If there are spots on Washington's character, they are like spots in the sun, only discernible by the magnifying powers of the telescope." But out of public view, he was at war with his generals. He had as much trouble with some of them as he did with the British.
Men like Charles Lee and Horatio Gates, men who'd been officers in the British Army, thought Washington was a bumpkin, someone who didn't know anything about an army or how to run a war. And they caused George a tremendous amount of trouble. They conspired, they talked behind his back, they spoke to members of Congress, they tried to discredit him, but in the end, he met them with patience and persistence, and their own incompetence ruined them. And George survived, and they didn't.
He survived in part because of the public relations war he waged. He gathered around him a staff of bright young men who could sharpen sentences like bayonets.
He had to convince Congress that he was winning, that the war was going well, even when he was not, and it was not. For this purpose, he pioneered that great American art form of military communication with the civilians. He didn't always tell the truth, but it was in the service, I suppose, of a larger truth.
By 1781, the fighting swirled across the South while Washington sat in his camp on the Hudson River and wondered how to dislodge the British from New York. In April, an English warship sailed up the Potomac and trained her guns on Mount Vernon itself. Most of Washington's beloved Virginia now lay under British control. No less a patriot than Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson begged Washington to come home and save his state. Washington declined.
He refused because he knew the most important scenes of military operations were further north.
When Jefferson called upon Washington to defend his home and his state, he was talking to a Washington who no longer existed. Washington's allegiance was no longer to the country he had grown up in, English Virginia, but was an allegiance to the future.
When the French joined the fight against their ancient British enemy, the future looked bright to Washington. But his generals continued to carp, his hungry troops threatened mutiny, his teeth ached. And his record on the battlefield, 3 wins, 9 losses, and 1 tie, was no source of pride to a proud man. But the best battle to win is the last one, and Washington endured long enough to win it. The 3-week siege at Yorktown ended there. The war
Yorktown was the victory that Washington and the Americans needed. And in the surrender ceremony, Washington was also able to even the score on some of the humiliations that he and the American forces had received from the British. When Lord Cornwallis, the British commander-in-chief, pled illness and did not attend the surrender ceremony, but instead sent his own second-in-command to make the formal surrender, Washington coolly referred the British general to his second-in-command to receive the surrender.
Washington was at his best in those kinds of interpersonal, diplomatic, and political moments. He knew exactly how to play them. There was no more shrewd and skillful political actor in that era or perhaps any other.
He had played the roles, gentleman and general, and he had become the characters. He had learned the gestures, put on the trappings, and found within himself the men he had hoped to be. Now he took this road north to his most important performance. Washington established new headquarters on the Hudson to keep his eye on the British Army downstream on Manhattan and await the signing of a treaty. He could wait, but his officers could not.
Let me set the scene. It's the end of the war. Washington's generals and his high staff officers are disgruntled. They haven't been paid. They don't trust the Congress. They're not so sure that it's such a good idea to give over control of this new nation to this bunch of squabbling politicians. Many among them wanted Washington to assume greater power, in fact, maybe dictatorial power.
What the real intent was, we shall probably never know. It could have been as much as a coup d'etat that would have established a military dictatorship. There was even occasional mention of Washington as a king. Others have thought it might have been an effort simply to stage a political maneuver. But I think we cannot underestimate the apparent seriousness of the intent.
His officers called a meeting at their headquarters at the New Windsor Cantonment for the night of March 15th, 1783. They would debate a move against Congress to demand their back pay at gunpoint if necessary. Washington knew he had to confront them. First, he retired to his Newburgh headquarters to write a speech. He agonized over every sentence and every word.
He was ripped apart inside. He had suffered with these men. He'd watched them die. He'd watched them be wounded for their country. He knew what they had given up. He knew how Congress had mistreated them. And a part of him was attracted by their offer to be a kind of king. And he knew for certain that if he gave in to their offer, if he gave in to the allure of power, not only would he betray his country, but he would also betray the reputation and the honor that had been so hard for him to attain.
He rode alone to the officers' meeting. They made way for him as he entered, but he saw no smiles, and he heard no applause when he stood before them and begged them not to open the floodgates of civil war and drown the new nation in blood. He knew that he was failing, so he decided to read a copy of a letter from Congress, once again promising payment. It might work where his eloquence had not. He held the letter in front of him and began to read. But something was wrong. The officers drew closer. Then Washington took out a pair of glasses and put them on. No one in the audience had ever seen him in his glasses before. The officers were shocked. Washington looked out and said, "Gentlemen, you will forgive the spectacles. Not only have I grown gray in your service, but now I find myself going blind." With that, he brought them to tears.
He had an instinctual sense of the right gesture at the right moment. He knew that his glasses would be a symbol of his own weakness and vulnerability, and he hoped that this would persuade his men that by betraying their country in this manner, they were also betraying him personally.
It's high political acting of the sort he learned from such English playwrights as Addison. But what he did was he staged that performance in order to rescue control of the new government from a disgruntled military and to return it to civilian power where it belongs. And in that moment, we have fused the extraordinary political performance of George Washington, the ambitious would-be leader, and the principles about politics and about civilian rule which restrained him even in the moment of his highest acting.
He never finished the letter. He knew that he had them. He stepped from the stage and strode to the door, and the conspiracy collapsed.
What he had wanted all his life was honor, reputation, and ultimately lasting historic fame. And what he learned, especially in the course of the Revolution, was that the way to achieve those goals was by his scrupulous subordination to civilian authority, his careful and restrained exercise of the powers granted to him, and finally his willingness to give up that power when the time came, when the war ended.
All that was left was the formality of history. 9 months later, Washington went to Annapolis and surrendered his commission and his army to Congress. In England, King George said, "If Washington can do this, he'll be the greatest man in the world." The grand irony of his life, which in the beginning had been based on acquisition, was that he did not secure the reputation he sought until he gave something up: power. In the process, Washington assured the survival of the world's first modern democracy. He was the commander-in-chief that the revolutionaries had expected him to be, but more than that, he was the man who would not be king.